When a ruthless billionaire humiliates his pregnant wife over an affair she never had, he thinks he's won. But 3 years later, the truth slaps him harder than karma ever could, and he never saw it coming. The grand chandelier of the Ashford estate shimmered with an ethereal glow, casting golden light across the vast ballroom. Elegantly dressed guests floated through the space, their laughter and conversation blending into a soft, melodic hum. It was an evening of prestige, where only the elite gathered, and among them stood the host, Dominic Ashford, a man whose name commanded respect and power. At 36, Dominic was the epitome of success. His empire stretched across industries, real estate, tech, and finance, earning him the title of one of the youngest self-made billionaires. Tall and striking, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, he carried himself with an effortless confidence that bordered on arrogance. Yet despite the power and influence he wielded, there was one element of his life he had long kept tightly controlled: his marriage to Evelyn Ashford. Evelyn had once been the jewel of Dominic's world. She was radiant, graceful, and kind, the perfect wife for a man of his stature. Their love story had been one that captivated many, the reserved billionaire and the kind-hearted woman who softened his edges. She had been his balance, his calm amidst the storm of business rivalries and corporate warfare. But tonight, standing in the center of the grand celebration, Dominic felt nothing but betrayal. Whispers floated through the room like poisonous threads weaving a cruel tapestry. The hushed murmurs of scandal had reached his ears earlier that day. His wife, pregnant with another man's child. Dominic had dismissed the notion at first. Impossible. Evelyn had been loyal, devoted. Why would she betray him? But when his assistant, Miles, handed him the photographs, his world cracked. The images told the story he refused to believe. Evelyn walking into an upscale hotel. Evelyn slipping through the back entrance. Evelyn embracing another man in a dimly lit corridor. The evidence was undeniable. And so, tonight's grand gala, intended to be a celebration of yet another business victory, became something else entirely. Dominic had no interest in keeping his disgrace a private affair. If Evelyn had humiliated him in secret, he would return the favor in full view of the world. He stepped onto the stage, his champagne flute raised, commanding the attention of the crowd. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him, eager for the toast. Evelyn, standing off to the side in her flowing crimson gown, unaware of the storm about to descend. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dominic's voice was steady, cold. "Tonight we celebrate success. We celebrate loyalty. We celebrate trust." He paused, his sharp gaze flickering to Evelyn. "Or at least we should." Confused glances exchanged. Unease rippled through the room. Evelyn furrowed her brows, sensing something was terribly wrong. "But as we gather here, I've come to realize that trust is an illusion," Dominic continued, his lips curled in mock amusement. "And betrayal, well, betrayal comes from those you least expect." The whispers grew louder. Evelyn's breath hitched. A cold dread snaked through her veins. Dominic turned fully toward her, his voice a lethal blade. "Isn't that right, darling?" The ballroom fell into dead silence. Evelyn's heart pounded against her ribs. "Dominic, what are you doing?" He gestured toward the grand screen at the center of the hall. The images appeared, larger than life. Evelyn, the hotel, the man, the embrace, the final nail in the coffin. A gasp tore through the crowd. Scandal. Evelyn's face went pale. Her lips parted, but no words came. "Let me spare you all the pretense," Dominic announced, his voice dripping with venom. "My dear wife, Evelyn Ashford, is carrying another man's child." Gasps erupted. The murmurs turned into full-blown chaos. Evelyn staggered back as if struck. "No, Dominic, that's not true," he sneered. "Tell me, should I be celebrating the child you conceived in another man's bed?" Tears burned in her eyes. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. That's not— "Get out!" Dominic spat. Evelyn froze. "You want to ruin my name, my legacy? Then you will do so far away from here," he said coldly. "From this moment forward, you are nothing to me." A single tear slipped down her cheek. Dominic turned away as if she no longer existed. And with that, Evelyn Ashford, the wife of the billionaire, became nothing but a fallen woman in the eyes of the world. The only thing that remained was the weight of betrayal, the suffocating judgment of society, and the life she carried inside her, a child who now had no father. 3 years later, everything would change. The New York City skyline glittered with the distant glow of penthouse lights and flashing billboards. The world continued to move at an unforgiving pace, indifferent to the scars left behind by time. Somewhere amid the vast, relentless city, Dominic Ashford sat behind a towering glass window in his office, his fingers drumming rhythmically on the cold mahogany desk. It had been 3 years since that night, the night when he had stood before the elite, microphone in hand, and condemned his wife in front of the world. 3 years since he had last seen her face. 3 years since he had erased her from his life. Yet, despite his efforts to bury her name and suffocate the memories, Evelyn Ashford still lingered, not just in the farthest corners of his mind, but in the deep, unspoken recesses of his heart. Dominic clenched his jaw. He had done the right thing. Evelyn had betrayed him. She had humiliated him. She had shattered the vows they had sworn to uphold. So why, after all this time, did he feel as if something wasn't right? A sharp knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. He exhaled, straightening in his chair as Miles Turner, his assistant, stepped in with the same professional briskness Dominic had come to expect from him. "Sir," Miles began, adjusting his glasses, "I have the reports you requested." Dominic's expression didn't shift, but tension settled in his chest like a vice. He didn't have to ask which reports. He had been doing this for the past 3 years, ordering private investigations, having her name monitored, pretending that it was all out of simple curiosity. But deep down, he knew better, and Miles did too. "Say what you need to say," Dominic muttered, keeping his voice neutral. Miles hesitated, then stepped forward, placing a thin folder on the desk. His voice was careful, almost cautious. "Evelyn Ashford is back in New York." Dominic's fingers froze against the desk. Slowly, he lifted his gaze. "Where?" Miles flipped open the file, revealing recent photographs. Evelyn stood on a stage, poised and elegant, speaking into a microphone. The golden lights of the venue illuminated her face, one that Dominic hadn't seen in years, yet had never truly forgotten. "She's running a business," Miles explained. "A non-profit foundation called the Starlight Foundation. It provides housing, medical aid, and education for single mothers and children in need. It's grown exponentially in the past 2 years and has received funding from multiple investors." Dominic scoffed, though something tightened in his chest. "Of course," he muttered, voice laced with dry amusement. "How ironic." Miles hesitated. "Sir, did she remarry?" Miles paused for a moment, then shook his head. "No." The answer landed heavier than Dominic had expected. No other man. For some inexplicable reason, the thought sent a sharp jolt through his system. "She's currently attending a charity gala," Miles continued, flipping the next page. "At the Langston Hotel." Dominic's breath stilled. The Langston Hotel. The same venue where he had accused her of betrayal. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. For 3 years, Dominic had convinced himself that Evelyn was nothing, a stain on his past, a painful mistake. But now, watching these images, he was beginning to feel something far worse than anger, regret. And Dominic Ashford did not do regret. His gaze flickered toward the photographs in front of him. Evelyn's expression was composed, but her eyes, they were different, stronger, unshaken. He had expected to see a woman left in ruins, struggling under the weight of his absence. Instead, he saw someone reborn, and that realization sent a cold shudder through him. Miles shifted slightly. "Sir, if you want, I can—" But Dominic was already reaching for his suit jacket. Miles sighed, already knowing what that meant. "You're going to the gala, aren't you?" Dominic didn't reply. He simply buttoned his jacket, straightened his tie, and walked out the door. Langston Hotel, 9:15 p.m. The air was thick with perfume, laughter, and the delicate clinking of champagne glasses. The grand ballroom of the Langston Hotel was a vision of luxury, filled with the city's elite, powerful executives, renowned socialites, and investors with deep pockets. At the far end of the room, standing beneath the cascading glow of a chandelier, was Evelyn. She was different. Dominic had spent years picturing her in his mind, but this woman, she wasn't the same Evelyn he had married. Or rather, she wasn't the broken woman he had left behind. Her midnight blue gown hugged her figure effortlessly, the soft fabric flowing like silk as she moved. Her hair cascaded in loose waves down her back, framing her delicate features, ones that had not faded in the slightest. But it wasn't her beauty that struck him hardest. It was the way she carried herself. She wasn't the shy, nervous woman who once leaned on his arm at events like this. She stood alone, unapologetic, powerful, as if she had never needed him in the first place. Dominic's fingers curled into a fist at his side. How was that possible? How had she built this life from nothing? He had taken everything from her. His mind replayed the past, the moment he had stood before the crowd and destroyed her reputation. And yet, here she was, respected, admired, untouchable. A slow wave of unease settled into Dominic's chest. Had I been wrong? The question gnawed at him. The air shifted suddenly. Evelyn turned, and their eyes met. For a brief second, time froze. The noise of the gala faded. The 3 years between them collapsed into nothing. And in that moment, Dominic saw it. Not pain, not anger, but indifference. She didn't hate him. She simply didn't care. That realization hit Dominic like a hammer to the chest. And for the first time in his entire life, the great Dominic Ashford felt powerless. Because he had expected her to be broken. But instead, she had moved on. And that was a fate he was not prepared for. The world seemed to fade into a blur around Dominic Ashford. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the idle chatter of Manhattan's elite, none of it reached him. Because she was there. Evelyn Ashford, the woman he had once loved, the woman he had once destroyed. And yet she stood across the room like a queen untouched by ruin. His breath hitched. Their eyes had met for only a fraction of a second, but it was long enough to gut him. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't looked away in shame or hurt. She had simply stared through him as if he were nothing more than a fleeting shadow in her past. Dominic's throat tightened. For years he had imagined this moment, convinced himself that if he ever saw her again, she'd be a shell of who she once was, hollowed out by regret, weighed down by loss. But she wasn't. She was radiant. Not just in the way her evening gown shimmered beneath the golden chandelier lights, but in the way she carried herself. Poised, confident, whole. His fingers curled into a fist at his side. How? How had she survived? How had she built an empire from the ruins of what he had left behind? Dominic swallowed hard, his pulse a relentless drumbeat against his ribs. "Sir?" A voice jolted him back to reality. Miles, his assistant, had stepped beside him, following his gaze toward Evelyn with a knowing look. "She's giving her speech soon," Miles said carefully. Dominic didn't respond. He couldn't. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what he was feeling. Anger? Regret? Something even worse? His jaw tightened as he reached for a glass of scotch from a passing waiter's tray. He lifted it to his lips, only to realize his hands were shaking. "Are you going to speak to her?" Miles asked quietly. Dominic took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze still fixed on the woman who had once been his wife. "No," he murmured. "Not yet." Not when he didn't even know what to say. Evelyn Ashford had spent years preparing for this moment. She had imagined it countless times, rehearsed how she would react, how she would not let him shake her. And now that she had finally seen Dominic Ashford again, she felt nothing. Not the pain she had once carried, not the fear that had once paralyzed her, not even the anger that had burned like wildfire in her veins. Just nothing. She took a measured breath, carefully lifting her champagne flute to her lips. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the silent disbelief in his eyes. He wasn't expecting this. He had expected her to crumble, to wilt under his presence, but he didn't know her anymore. The Evelyn he had left behind, the woman he had humiliated, discarded, and thrown to the wolves, no longer existed. And this was her proof. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes he had left behind, without him. Without his name, without his pity. A slow exhale left her lips as she placed her champagne flute back on the tray of a passing waiter. "Are you all right?" A familiar voice pulled her attention. Lucas Hale, her business partner and one of her closest friends. He stood beside her, his sharp gaze flickering toward the other end of the ballroom, where Dominic stood like a statue carved from ice. Evelyn forced a small, graceful smile. "Of course," she murmured. Lucas tilted his head, unconvinced. "You don't have to lie to me." Evelyn sighed, adjusting the delicate bracelet on her wrist. "I'm fine," she repeated, quieter this time. Lucas exhaled slowly, glancing back toward Dominic. "He looks miserable," he noted. Evelyn's lips curled into something that almost resembled amusement. "Well," she said lightly, "he should be." Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. "You're terrifying," he muttered. Evelyn smiled. Good. She wanted Dominic to see this. She wanted him to realize that she had never needed his name or his wealth, that he had discarded something priceless. And now she was untouchable. The sound of a microphone crackling to life hushed the room. Evelyn took the stage, her heart steady, her expression unreadable. "Good evening," she began, her voice smooth yet unshakable. The ballroom quieted, all eyes drawn to her. Dominic watched from a distance, gripping his glass tightly. "There was a time in my life," Evelyn continued, "when I thought my world had collapsed, when I believed that losing everything meant I had lost myself." Dominic's grip on his drink tightened. Miles glanced at him warily, but Dominic barely noticed, because Evelyn's words were like a dagger sinking into his chest. "But I was wrong," she said, a faint smile gracing her lips, "because losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. Dominic felt his stomach drop. "I am here tonight," Evelyn continued, her gaze unwavering, "not because of the past, but because of what I built from it, because of the people who refused to let life define them by their worst moments, and because of the belief that no one, no matter how broken, is beyond rebuilding." Silence, thick, unforgiving. Dominic exhaled slowly, an unfamiliar tightness settling in his chest. She wasn't speaking to the audience, she was speaking to him, and for the first time in years, Dominic Ashford felt truly small. As the applause erupted around him, Dominic found himself unable to move. He had walked into this gala expecting to see a broken woman. Instead, he had come face to face with his biggest mistake. And worst of all, she didn't care anymore. The realization was like a slap to the face. He had spent years believing that she had been the one at fault, years convincing himself that he had done the right thing. But now he wasn't sure anymore. Dominic set his unfinished drink down, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Sir," Miles started cautiously, but Dominic didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away from the gala, away from the past, and away from the only woman who had ever truly mattered. Because tonight, for the first time in his life, Dominic Ashford had lost a war he didn't even realize he was fighting. Dominic Ashford sat in the back of his limousine, the city lights flickering past the tinted windows like ghosts of a past he could no longer outrun. The silence in the car was suffocating, pressing against his ribs with the weight of things left unsaid, of choices he could never undo. His hand, still wrapped around the forgotten glass of scotch, trembled slightly as he stared at his own reflection in the window. Evelyn was supposed to be shattered, ruined. Instead, she had stood on that stage, poised and powerful, speaking words that had burned him from the inside out. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't resentful. She was free, and that freedom had crushed him more than any revenge ever could. Miles sat across from him, his gaze unreadable. He had worked for Dominic long enough to know when to remain silent, but tonight, the silence was too heavy. "She was never supposed to move on like that," Dominic muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Miles exhaled quietly, adjusting his cufflinks before answering. "You didn't think she would? Or you didn't want her to?" Dominic's jaw clenched. "She should have suffered, I made sure of it." "Did you?" Miles arched a brow. "Because from where I stood, she didn't look like a woman who suffered. She looked like a woman who survived." Survived. The word sent a wave of nausea through Dominic. He had spent years convincing himself that Evelyn had deserved what she got, that her tears, her pleading, her desperation had been the deserved outcome of her betrayal. But seeing her tonight standing before New York's elite as an equal, as someone they admired, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She hadn't needed him, not his money, not his name. She had built something of her own, and it was bigger than him now. The car pulled up to the towering glass of Ashford Holdings, but Dominic didn't move. He sat there, fingers tightening around the edge of his seat, his chest burning with something dangerously close to regret. He had always thought himself a man who had no regrets, but now he wasn't sure. Not when the one thing he had thrown away was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Miles watched him carefully. "What are you going to do?" For the first time in a long time, Dominic didn't have an answer. Evelyn stepped into her penthouse, kicking off her heels with a quiet sigh. The gala had gone exactly as planned, but even as she curled onto her couch, something inside her refused to settle. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pain. It was something far more dangerous. It was Dominic. The look in his eyes had been brief, fleeting, but she had seen it. Shock, regret, something like loss. She knew she shouldn't care. She had spent years burying every piece of the woman who had once needed Dominic Ashford. But tonight, standing before him, she had realized something terrifying. There was still a part of her that remembered. The way he used to look at her when they first fell in love. The way his hand would always find hers under the table during long dinners. The way he had once told her, in the dead of night, that she was the only thing that made his world feel real. That man had died the night he had thrown her away. She had watched him kill the love between them with his own hands, with his own words, and she had sworn to herself that she would never let him back in. And yet, when their eyes met tonight, she had felt something shift. A crack in the wall she had built. A whisper of a past she had spent 3 years trying to forget. She stood abruptly, shaking her head. She wouldn't let herself fall into that trap. Not again. Dominic Ashford was a mistake she had already survived once. She wouldn't give him the chance to destroy her a second time. But no matter how much she told herself that, she knew, deep down, this wasn't over. Not yet. The following morning, Dominic sat at his desk, staring blankly at the city skyline. He had barely slept. His mind had been relentless, dragging him back to that moment over and over again. The way Evelyn had looked right through him, like he was nothing. For years he had convinced himself that his revenge had been justified, that Evelyn's affair had been an unforgivable betrayal. But what if it wasn't? What if he had been wrong? His hands clenched against the desk. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't second-guess himself. And yet here he was, spiraling over a woman he had tossed aside as if she had never meant anything at all. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Miles stepped in, his expression unreadable. "You need to see this," he said, placing a thick folder onto the desk. Dominic didn't move. "What is it?" "Everything we could find on Evelyn Ashford," Miles said simply. "I had my doubts, but now—" He hesitated before shaking his head. "You should read it yourself." Dominic's gut tightened. He hadn't looked into Evelyn since the divorce. He hadn't needed to. But as he reached for the folder, a sickening feeling crawled up his spine. He flipped it open, and the world tilted. Because staring back at him in a grainy, time-stamped photo was Evelyn, 3 years ago, pregnant and alone. Dominic's blood ran cold. His fingers shook as he turned the page. More photos. Evelyn leaving a hospital. Evelyn holding a baby. A baby. His baby. Dominic's lungs seized. His child. A son. The file slipped from his hands, pages scattering across the desk. But he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. For 3 years he had believed that Evelyn had been unfaithful, that the child she carried wasn't his. But now every single piece of that belief was crumbling. Miles exhaled slowly. It was a setup, Dominic. The affair, the photos, the entire thing was orchestrated. Dominic's heart slammed against his ribs. No, it couldn't be. He had seen the proof. He had seen the pictures, the messages, he had heard the whispers. But what if it had all been a lie? His fingers dug into the desk, knuckles turning white. "Who?" His voice was nothing more than a whisper, but it carried venom. Miles didn't hesitate. "Your father." The air was ripped from Dominic's lungs. He staggered back, his vision swimming. The betrayal cut through him like a blade, deeper than anything he had ever felt before. His own father had orchestrated the destruction of his marriage, had torn Evelyn from his life, had stolen his child. A wave of rage and regret unlike anything he had ever known crashed over him. He had spent 3 years hating a woman who had never wronged him. 3 years believing she had betrayed him. 3 years missing the birth of his own son. And it had all been a lie. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving. He had to see her. Now Dominic turned sharply, already moving for the door. Miles called after him. "Dom, wait, what are you going to do?" Dominic didn't stop, didn't answer, because there was only one thing he could do. Get her back, even if it was already too late. Dominic sat in Evelyn's living room, every nerve in his body taut with anticipation. He had expected rejection, had prepared himself for the door to be slammed in his face. Instead, she had let him in. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. Across the room, Evelyn sat on the couch, her arms wrapped protectively around their son. The little boy, still hesitant, peeked at Dominic with wide, curious eyes. What's his name? Dominic finally asked, his voice softer than he had ever heard it. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers brushing through their child's dark hair. Liam. Dominic's breath caught. Liam. The name settled deep in his chest, heavy and unfamiliar, yet so painfully his. His son. A name he should have known, a life he should have been a part of. He swallowed hard, glancing back at Liam, who was now fiddling with the hem of Evelyn's dress. He's beautiful, Dominic murmured. Evelyn's expression didn't change. She was guarded, wary, her walls as unyielding as ever. You don't get to do this, she said quietly. You don't get to show up after 3 years and act like you care. Dominic's stomach twisted. I do care, he said, his voice rough. I always did. Evelyn let out a bitter laugh. Really? Because the last time I saw you, you were calling me a liar in front of the entire world. You were standing on a podium, publicly humiliating me, our child, because you believed a story fed to you by your father. Dominic flinched, the memory slicing through him like a blade. I was wrong. Evelyn's jaw clenched. Wrong isn't a strong enough word for what you did. He nodded slowly. He wouldn't argue. There was no excuse for the pain he had caused her. No justification for the nights she must have cried herself to sleep, alone and abandoned, while he had continued his life as if she no longer existed. The weight of his actions pressed down on him with an unbearable force. I can't change the past, Dominic said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't undo what I did. Evelyn's gaze hardened. No, you can't. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then suddenly a small voice broke through. Mommy? Both Dominic and Evelyn turned. Liam was looking up at Evelyn, his tiny hands gripping her arm. Can I talk to him? The boy asked softly. Evelyn hesitated. For a long moment she simply stared at Dominic, searching his face, weighing something in her mind. Then, finally, she nodded. Dominic barely had time to react before Liam slid off the couch and approached him cautiously. Dominic's breath caught as his son stood in front of him for the first time. Hi, Liam said hesitantly. Dominic swallowed, forcing himself to breathe. Hi, buddy. Liam tilted his head, studying him. Are you really my daddy? Dominic's throat tightened. Yes, he whispered. I am. Liam didn't say anything right away. Instead, he looked over his shoulder at Evelyn, as if waiting for her approval. Evelyn gave him a soft nod, her lips pressed together in quiet encouragement. Liam turned back to Dominic. Why weren't you here before? Dominic's chest ached. Because I was an idiot, because I believed a lie, because I let my pride destroy everything that mattered. I didn't know, Dominic said instead, his voice thick with regret. I didn't know the truth, but now I do. Liam frowned as if trying to understand. But you know now? Dominic nodded. Yes, and I want to be here now if you'll let me. Liam was quiet for a moment. Then, to Dominic's shock, the boy reached out, his tiny fingers brushing against the sleeve of his jacket. Your suit is weird, Liam said, wrinkling his nose. Dominic let out a startled laugh, raw and unguarded. He hadn't laughed like that in years. Evelyn watched them, her expression unreadable. She wasn't smiling, but she also wasn't stopping their son from reaching out to him. That had to mean something, right? The hours passed in a blur of careful conversation, stolen glances, and moments that Dominic knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Liam was cautious but curious. He asked questions simple and innocent, yet each one cut Dominic to the core. Do you live far away? Did you know my birthday was last week? Mommy says I look like you. Every question was a reminder of the time he had lost, the years he could never get back. But he didn't let it break him, not this time. Instead, he answered Liam's questions with as much honesty as he could. Yes, he lived far away, but not far enough that he wouldn't visit whenever Liam wanted. No, he hadn't known about his birthday, but that was going to change. And yes, Liam did look like him. Dominic could see it now, so clearly it made his heart ache. As the evening stretched on, Evelyn eventually stood, her expression guarded once more. It's late, she said, her voice tight. Liam needs to go to bed. Liam frowned, pouting. But I want to keep talking. Evelyn hesitated as if unsure of what to do. Dominic stepped in carefully. Hey, buddy, he said softly. I'll come back. Liam's eyes widened. You promise? Dominic's throat tightened. Yes, he said firmly. I promise. Liam studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled. A small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. Dominic barely had time to register it before Evelyn stepped forward, gently taking Liam's hand. "Say goodnight," she murmured. Liam turned back to Dominic. "Good night, Daddy." Dominic's chest ached at the sound of the word. His son, his son. "Good night, Liam," he whispered. As Evelyn led Liam toward the hallway, she paused at the doorway. For the first time that night, she met Dominic's gaze with something other than anger. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't trust, but it was something. And as she turned away, disappearing into the house, Dominic knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't leaving this time. He was going to fight. For his son. For Evelyn. For everything he had lost. No matter how long it took. No matter what he had to do. He was going to earn back the family he had thrown away. And this time, he wouldn't let them go. The night after Dominic left Evelyn's house, he sat in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline. It was a view he had once found comforting, a symbol of the empire he had built. But now, all he could think about was Liam's tiny fingers brushing against his sleeve, his hesitant, "Good night, Daddy," and Evelyn's guarded gaze. He had been given an inch of grace, but he knew he was still a stranger to his son, a stranger to the woman he once loved, and that wasn't good enough. The next morning, Dominic made his first move. He showed up at Evelyn's cafe. It was a small place tucked into a quiet street, but it had a warmth that felt nothing like the sterile, lifeless buildings he owned. The scent of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air as he stepped inside, his gaze immediately landing on Evelyn behind the counter. She saw him the second he walked in, her hand stilled over the cash register, her body going rigid. But she didn't ask him to leave. Progress. Dominic walked up to the counter, his voice low and careful. "Good morning?" Evelyn lifted an eyebrow. "What are you doing here?" He didn't hesitate. "I'm here for breakfast." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You don't even drink coffee, Dominic." He smirked slightly. "Maybe I'm learning." Evelyn didn't look amused, but she still grabbed a menu and slid it across the counter. Small victories. Dominic took a seat by the window, keeping his eyes on her as she moved through the cafe. It was a side of Evelyn he had never seen before. Working, chatting with customers, smiling. She looked happy, and it hit him like a gut punch. He had spent the last 3 years wallowing in guilt, but Evelyn, she had survived. She had built something for herself, for Liam, without him. And now he had to prove that he deserved a place in the life she had created. A few minutes later, Evelyn placed a plate of pancakes and coffee in front of him. "You hate sweet things," she said flatly. Dominic picked up his fork, unfazed. "Maybe I've changed." Evelyn didn't respond, but as she turned to leave, he spoke again. "I meant what I said last night, Evelyn. I'm not going anywhere." She stiffened slightly. Then, without looking back, she walked away. Dominic kept coming back. Every morning, without fail, he was at the cafe. He sat at the same table, ordered the same thing, and waited. He didn't push, didn't force conversation, and he just showed up. And slowly, bit by bit, the tension began to fade. Liam started coming out of the kitchen more often, sneaking curious glances at him. Evelyn stopped bristling every time he walked through the door. And after a week, when Dominic entered the cafe, Liam ran up to him and grinned. "Hey, Daddy!" The word still sent a shock through Dominic every time he heard it. But this time it felt real. Dominic crouched down, ruffling his son's hair. "Hey, buddy, you help your mom in the kitchen today?" Liam nodded excitedly. "I cracked an egg all by myself." Dominic chuckled. "That's impressive." Liam beamed. Then, before Dominic could respond, the boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I made this for you," Liam said, handing it to him. Dominic carefully unfolded the paper. It was a drawing. A crude but recognizable sketch of 3 stick figures. One tall, one with long hair, and one small, standing between them. Mommy, Liam, and Daddy. Dominic swallowed hard. His vision blurred for a split second before he forced himself to focus. "This is amazing," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Thank you, Liam." Liam's smile stretched even wider. And Evelyn? She stood behind the counter watching them. For the first time since he had come back. She didn't look at him with anger. She looked tired. Like she wanted to believe him, like she wanted to let him in. But was too afraid. Dominic understood. He had shattered her trust once. Now he had to earn it back. The days passed in a rhythm Dominic had never known before. He still ran his company. still handled billion-dollar deals and high-profile meetings. But now his mornings belonged to Evelyn and Liam. It became routine. Breakfast at the cafe, walking Liam to preschool, learning things about his son that he should have known from the very beginning. Liam liked superheroes and hated broccoli. He loved story time but always fell asleep before the ending. He had a tiny freckle on his nose, just like Dominic did. And every day, Dominic found himself falling deeper into fatherhood. But Evelyn was harder to crack. She was polite to him now, but guarded. She let him take Liam to the park, but never let him pick him up from school. She listened when he spoke, but never truly let him in. Until one night, everything changed. It was a stormy evening. Liam had been playing outside when the rain started, and by the time Evelyn brought him inside, he was shivering. An hour later, he was burning with fever. Dominic had never felt fear like this before. Not when he made his first million. Not when he built his empire. Nothing had ever terrified him the way Liam's small, fragile body did as he lay curled up on the couch, whimpering. Evelyn sat beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead, her own face pale with worry. "His temperature is too high," she murmured, barely looking at Dominic. "I'll call a doctor," Dominic said immediately, already grabbing his phone. Evelyn didn't argue. 10 minutes later, a private physician arrived, checking Liam over. "He'll be okay," the doctor assured them. "Just a virus. Keep him hydrated. Let him rest." Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping. Dominic's own heart finally slowed. Then, for the first time in 3 years, Evelyn turned to him, really looked at him, and without a word, she leaned into his chest. Dominic froze, but then, slowly, carefully, he wrapped his arms around her. She was shaking, not from cold, but from the weight of being a mother, from the exhaustion of carrying it all alone. And in that moment, Dominic vowed more than ever, she wouldn't have to do it alone anymore, not if he had anything to say about it. The storm passed, but something had shifted. Evelyn didn't push Dominic away that night. She had leaned into him, even if just for a moment, and Dominic hadn't let go. He stayed at the house, sitting by the couch while Liam slept, his little chest rising and falling steadily. Every so often, Dominic would glance at Evelyn, who sat beside him, her head resting on the armrest. She had fallen asleep, exhaustion finally pulling her under. Dominic watched her for a long moment, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the soft furrow of her brows even in sleep. She had carried so much alone, and he had been the reason for it. Regret settled deep in his chest, heavy and unforgiving. For the first time in his life, Dominic wasn't thinking about deals, investments, or power. He was thinking about them, his wife, his son, the life he had thrown away. And for the first time, he realized he didn't just want to be a father to Liam, he wanted to be a husband to Evelyn again. But did he even deserve the chance? The next morning, Evelyn woke up with a start, her eyes darting toward Liam. He was still asleep, his fever lower but not gone. And Dominic was still there. He was sitting on the floor, his head leaning back against the couch, his eyes closed. She blinked, half expecting him to vanish like a ghost. But no, he was real. And he had stayed. Evelyn exhaled quietly, pressing a hand to her temple. She wasn't sure how to feel about it. For 3 years, she had forced herself to move on, to erase the pain, the humiliation, the heartbreak. But now he was here and worse. He was showing up every day, for Liam, for her, and a part of her, one she wasn't ready to acknowledge, was terrified. Because what if she let him back in, and he broke her again? Dominic kept proving himself in the days that followed. Liam recovered, his energy returning in full force, and with it came his excitement for spending time with his father. He started asking for Dominic every morning. Started grabbing his hand when they walked to school together. Started calling him Dad without hesitation. And Evelyn. She watched it all unfold with an ache in her chest. She wanted to protect Liam, wanted to shield him from the possibility that Dominic would leave again. But Dominic wasn't leaving. He was patient, careful, not pushing, not demanding. He was consistent. And that was the part that scared Evelyn the most. Because if he kept showing up, she might start believing in him again. And she wasn't sure she could survive that kind of betrayal twice. One evening, after Liam had gone to bed, Dominic lingered in the living room. Evelyn stood by the sink, rinsing off a few dishes, her movements slow and deliberate. She knew he was still there, knew he was watching her. Finally, she spoke. You don't have to stay, you know. Dominic leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. I want to. Evelyn let out a quiet sigh. That's not the same as needing to. Dominic's jaw tightened. I do need to, Evelyn. She froze. He continued. I need to be here. I need to fix what I broke. Not just for Liam. For you, too. Evelyn turned off the faucet, gripping the edge of the sink. Her heart pounded. She hadn't let herself believe those words for years, and now, hearing them, it felt like opening a door she had long since bolted shut. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Words are easy, Dominic. He nodded, stepping closer. I know, that's why I'm proving it with actions. Evelyn studied him, and for the first time, she let herself wonder, what if he really had changed? What if he meant it? What if, after all this time, she still loved him? The thought sent a wave of panic through her. She turned back to the sink, her fingers tightening around the dish towel. Dominic didn't push, didn't demand. He just stood there, waiting. And that night, when he finally left, Evelyn stared at the closed door, feeling something she hadn't in years. Hope. The next week brought more changes. Liam's birthday was coming up, and Evelyn had planned a small gathering, just close friends and family. But then Dominic did something unexpected. He booked out an entire park. Evelyn found out when Liam came running into the house, his face glowing with excitement. Mommy, Daddy got a whole park for my birthday. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She turned to Dominic, who stood in the doorway, watching her carefully. I wanted to do something special for him, he said quietly. Evelyn's jaw clenched. This isn't special, Dominic. This is excessive. He took a slow breath. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I wanted to make up for the birthdays I missed. Evelyn's anger faltered. Liam was still beaming, looking between them expectantly. And just like that, she couldn't bring herself to argue. So she let it happen. And when Liam's birthday arrived, she saw something she hadn't expected. Dominic wasn't just throwing money at the event. He was there, fully present, laughing, playing, running around with Liam like a man who had never worn a tailored suit in his life. And Evelyn. She found herself watching him, really watching him, not as the man who betrayed her, not as the billionaire CEO, but as Liam's father, and as the man who, somewhere deep down, she had never stopped loving. But love wasn't enough. Trust had to come first, and she wasn't sure if she could give him that yet. So when the party ended and Dominic walked up to her, hopeful, his voice low, Evelyn, can we talk? She swallowed hard, then shook her head. Not yet. Dominic's shoulders tensed, but he nodded. Okay. And that was it. No argument and no frustration, and just patience, and maybe that was what scared Evelyn the most. Because if he was willing to wait, it meant he was serious, and if he was serious, then maybe, just maybe, she was running out of reasons to keep pushing him away. Evelyn stood frozen, the world around her dissolving into white noise. Caleb's smug smirk burned into her vision. But her mind raced beyond the present, beyond the past 3 years of pain. Everything, every moment of heartbreak, every tear shed in silence, every bitter night spent hating Dominic. It had all been built on a lie. And now, standing in front of the man who had orchestrated it, Evelyn felt something she hadn't in a long time. Rage, raw, unfiltered. A storm breaking free after years of silence. She took a slow breath, forcing her trembling hands to still. Then, with a voice like steel, she whispered, You ruined my life. Caleb chuckled, stepping closer. Oh, come now, Evelyn, let's not be dramatic, you survived. Evelyn's nails dug into her palms. You stole everything from me. Caleb tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with amusement. No, sweetheart, Dominic gave it away. I just nudged him in the right direction. Evelyn's breath hitched. A dangerous calm settled over her. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? Caleb had planted the seed. But Dominic had let it grow, and that was what she could never forget. She exhaled, her voice eerily quiet. You're a snake, Caleb, but even snakes get crushed eventually. Caleb smirked, unbothered. We'll see about that. And with that he walked away, leaving her standing there, her entire world tilted on its axis. Evelyn barely remembered how she got home. Her body moved on autopilot, her mind replaying Caleb's words over and over. The truth sat heavy in her chest, an unbearable weight pressing down on her ribs. She had spent 3 years hating Dominic, 3 years believing he had chosen to betray her. But in reality, he had been played. The question was Dash. What did she do now? Her phone buzzed. She barely glanced at the screen before answering. Evelyn. Dominic's voice, deep, familiar. The sound sent an ache straight to her bones. She gripped the phone tighter. I need to see you, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. A pause, and then, I'll be there in 10 minutes. Evelyn stood by the window, watching the headlights approach the driveway. Her heart pounded in her chest. Dominic had no idea what was coming. A part of her wanted to scream at him, to throw every ounce of pain she had carried for the last 3 years into his face. But another part, a deeper, quieter part, just wanted the truth, the real truth. Not the one twisted by Caleb's lies. The doorbell rang. Evelyn turned, took a slow breath, and opened the door. Dominic stood there, his gaze searching hers, his usual confidence replaced by something softer, something hesitant, something she wasn't ready to name. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. You okay? He asked. Evelyn exhaled a sharp laugh. No, Dominic, I'm not. His brow furrowed. What's wrong? She studied him, looking for any sign of deception. She found none. So she whispered the words that would change everything. I saw Caleb tonight. Dominic stilled, and his entire body went rigid. What? She swallowed hard. He told me everything, Dominic, about the lies, about how he fed you that story. A muscle ticked in Dominic's jaw. His hands clenched at his sides. Evelyn took a shaky breath. Tell me the truth. Dominic's voice was hoarse. What do you want to know? She met his eyes, her own filled with something raw. Did you ever doubt me? Silence. Dominic's throat bobbed. His gaze flickered, and in that single moment, she knew. She knew the answer before he even said it. His voice cracked, and that was all it took. Evelyn felt her heart shatter all over again. She took a step back, laughing bitterly. Oh my God. Dominic ran a hand through his hair, looking pained. Evelyn, listen to me. She shook her head. No, Dominic, I need to hear it right now. Her voice broke. Did you ever believe me? Dominic's face twisted. I wanted to, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I was. Too proud? She cut in, her eyes flashing. Too scared? Dominic exhaled heavily. Yes. The word sliced through her like a blade. She staggered back, pressing a hand to her chest as if that would keep it from splitting open. Dominic reached for her. But she flinched away. He froze. A sharp, painful silence stretched between them. Then, I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that, she whispered. Dominic's expression crumbled. I know. Evelyn closed her eyes because that was the worst part of all. She wanted to forgive him. She just didn't know if she could. The next morning, Dominic showed up at her doorstep, not with flowers and not with apologies, but with evidence. Folders, documents, bank statements, proof of every lie Caleb had spun, proof that Dominic had been played just as much as she had, and proof that Dominic wasn't just saying sorry. He was making it right. He had pressed charges against Caleb, had cut all ties, had even stepped down from his own company, refusing to benefit from a business that had been built on lies. Evelyn stared at the papers spread across her table, then at the man standing before her, Dominic Luxford, once the man who had destroyed her life, now Dash, the man who was trying to rebuild it. She swallowed hard. Then, voice trembling, she asked the only question that mattered. Why are you doing all of this? Dominic met her gaze, his own filled with something raw. Because I love you, Evelyn. She inhaled sharply. I never stopped. Her hands shook. 3 years, Dominic! His voice cracked. I know. She looked at him, truly looked at him. And for the first time, she didn't see the man who had left her. She saw the man who had lost her, and wanted nothing more than to find his way back. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but this time she didn't fight them. Because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe this was the beginning of something real, of something worth fighting for. And as Dominic took a hesitant step closer, reaching for her hand, she let him, because love wasn't about never falling. It was about choosing to stand up again. Together, the end. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Your thoughts mean the world to us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.